Turnbull. I work at Cardiff Business School, where I'm Professor of Human Resource Management and Labour Relations. I started my academic career at the London School of Economics at a research centre, the Centre for Labour Economics, where our job was to explain unemployment in the early 1980s. I then moved to the Industrial Relations Research Unit at the University of Warwick. I came to Cardiff first in 1988. I was here for 5 years, and then went to the University of Leeds, then came back to Cardiff to my current position as Professor in 1997, so I've been here ever since. Most of the work I do is involved looking at the impact of the labour market and how the labour market is regulated in terms of its impact on the nature of work, levels of employment, and also the performance of ports as well, competitiveness of the industry. I've also had a long-standing interest as well in trade union organisation, social dialogue and industrial conflict in the industry. It's an industry which historically has had more than its fair share of industrial strife. And also as well a long-standing interest in the changing nature of work, so the impact of new technology, information technologies, how this is affecting the composition of labour force, access of different groups to the labour market. The initial work I did on ports in the UK was with the National Dock Labour Board. When I was actually working at the London School of Economics, we were looking at the impact of trade unions on wage determination and employment. And the Dock Labour Board used to keep very, very good records, very detailed records by individual ports. So I developed an interest just in the labour scheme. And when I first came to Cardiff in 1988, I decided to do a project looking at the impact of the scheme compared to non-scheme ports. I made an application to the SRC, but while that was being considered, the government abolished the labour scheme. So I then revised that project and looked at the impact of the abolition of the dock labour scheme on the ports. And there were a few strands to that. One was just the impact of deregulating the labour market and what effect that had on employment. There was also an interest in privatisation as well, because that, I mean, some ports had already been privatised, but there was a Privatisation Act which came in fairly soon after the abolition of the labour scheme. And then also there was the whole issue of redundancies and job losses in the industry. So we actually had a separate research project, again funded by the SRC, to look at the redundancy scheme that accompanied the abolition of the labour scheme. The UK had gone along the road of privatising ports, even privatising port land, whereas in other countries you still have public port authorities who licence private companies to operate, often on very long-term leases, but these companies then invest in the industry. So we undertook a comparative study of 8 European countries to look at, again, the impact of different general kind of regulatory labour and management systems, so different forms of ownership, different management structures, and in particular the impact of different labour arrangements in the industry in terms of dock labour schemes. In some countries they still have labour pools. There are all kinds of implications there for training of workers, skill levels, whether workers for example, work regularly for the same companies, or whether they are hired out on a daily basis to different companies. All these things have quite a significant impact on productivity. So in all those studies, we were using a combination of statistical data on port performance, and also lots of kind of case studies, qualitative research. In the mid-1990s, we began to see the emergence of these global operators, companies like Hutchison. P&O Ports Australia at the time was beginning to invest in a number of Asian countries. So we took the opportunity to look again at the impact of all these regulatory changes. And the focus was very much more on the management of ports as opposed to the labour side of it, but again that was an important element of this. The focus of it was very much towards Asia, which obviously complemented the work that we were doing at the same time on European ports as well. And again, there's some very interesting contrast there in terms of port performance, because the scarcity of land in some of these Asian ports, I mean, they have very, very different operational and control systems on container terminals, just in terms of the stacking systems, the technology that they use. It was really an opportunity to see how these global companies were, in a sense, were adapting to local cultures and local employment arrangements. I've had a long-standing interest in industrial conflict in the ports, mainly, I suppose, primarily because you can't get away from it. There are frequent strikes in ports. Dock workers do have a reputation for militancy. In a lot of the kind of classic sociological studies from the 60s, dock workers were identified as one of these kind of isolated masses, these kind of a group apart from the rest of society. When the government announced the abolition of the National Dock Labour Scheme in 1989, we actually put together a research group around the country to study the national strike. So we looked at the impact of different employment arrangements in the UK ports, and the impact in particular of the decasualisation scheme that came in 1967, when dock workers changed from being casual to permanent workers, and looked at what impact that had on strikes. A lot of the outcomes of that were quite surprising to us, and I think had we got some of the results that people might have predicted, that it would lead to a reduction in conflict, might have just left it at that. But the fact that that changing from a casual to a permanent system didn't seem to have a particularly marked impact on levels of strike activity. There were so many other things kind of going on at the time. So we investigated that further, but also began to look further afield. For example, in Rotterdam, throughout from the 1960s, there was one strike in 1970 and one in 1979. The last major strike in the port of Antwerp was 1961. So dockers had this reputation for militancy, but there were some ports where, you know, strikes were very rare. There were other mechanisms for dealing with conflict. One of the projects I'm working on at the moment, looking to develop, is a project on social dialogue in the European Union. Back in 2001, the European Commission proposed a directive for a new European ports policy, which port workers objected to because of provisions there for self-handling, which would allow shipping lines, for example, to hire their own labour rather than hire recognised dock workers from the ports. And the port unions organised a very successful campaign of industrial and political action against that. What developed during the kind of campaigns of action against these proposed directives was that the parties began to meet together. They actually realised that they actually shared some quite significant common interests. And after many years of opposing a sector social dialogue committee, the employers agreed to set one up. So I've been looking at the formation of this committee and some of its initial, the kind of objectives of the different parties. And the idea is to look at how this committee will work in practice compared to some of the other sector social dialogue committees. At the same time, we have another project with the International Labour Organization looking at training. So we're in the process of developing a set of guidelines on competency-based approaches to training in the port sector. The ILO currently has a very extensive training package, the Port Worker Development Programme. And this is an attempt to create a more kind of general set of guidelines about good practice in the area of port worker training. The final project, specifically the employment of women in ports. Traditionally, dock work has been a male-only occupation. But if you go to the port of Valencia, for example, in Spain now, you'll find that 12% of the workforce are women. And that's quite a major change just in terms of the kind of work culture and you know, methods of training. You know, there are still tests for example, lashing in ports, which require people to lift very heavy bars, which obviously disadvantages women. And so that, you know, again, ports are looking at the whole issue around training and you know, whether some of these physical strength tests are actually necessary to do the job. But again, it's looking at how ports deal with these changes in the industry, in the labour market, and how these people are managed, which again all comes back to this kind of ongoing theme that's runs throughout my work.